So, hey guys, this is Samantha. She's a wellness program manager. And due to the nature of her work, she's basically interacted with hundreds of clients across different workplace settings, different geographies, different cultures, all of that stuff. And so I think she's one of the most qualified people to kind of give us her insights and share some stories about the topic that we have at hand today. So, first of all, Samantha, nice to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the topic we have at hand today is mental health in the workplace. So I'll just give a brief introduction of the topic. So every time this topic comes up, there's more and more people who are kind of aware of mental health. It's always a rising curve, and not only in workplace settings, also in personal settings as well. So people are getting more and more aware of this. They're getting more and more demanding of, platforms and basically services that cater to their mental health, and it's no different in the workplace wellness industry as well. But today we're going to kind of explore if this is actually the case, whether the industry's kept up with the demands or it's kind of fallen flat. So let me just jump straight into it with the first question. So Samantha, what's the dumbest thing you've personally seen a company do in the name of supporting mental health?
Yeah. So one of the most criticized, like probably moves I've seen, has to be the, corporate pizza party for, a team that has really been drowning in burnout or really just overworked. Someone is putting in 60 hours a week, running on fumes, and the response is, a box of pizza in the break room. It's
Hmm.
not that the gesture itself is bad. It's treated as a fix. Free food doesn't reduce anyone's workload or change the expectations, that really got them there in the first place. It really
Hmm.
just tells people that the company noticed, that they're struggling and decided to just give them a slice of pepperoni pizza as an appropriate response. Another thing I also see is just generic, self practice, like phrases like, just telling people to drink water or take a walk to cure,
Hmm.
structural stress or clinical conditions when that's not the case at all. And I think, they're not really diving deep into a lot that's going on, and they're just, fixing it with like, drink more water, you'll be okay, get back to work. So those are probably two of, the most criticized moves I've seen in companies before.
Right, right, right. I can see it being as kind of like a just a generic fix, oh, pizza will probably make them happy, or just like
Yeah.
general health advice. It's not like really personalized. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So if we kind of look at this, so this is actually a great example, right? The fixing things instead of like actually diagnosing it. So it's basically that the company is kind of lying to themselves as well, right? So this leads very well into the next question. So if you kind of had to bet money on it, what would you say? Like, what percentage of companies that say mental health is a priority are actually lying to themselves, like literally not to us, but to themselves?
Yeah, if I had to bet, I'd say somewhere around 70%. And it's
Hmm.
not that leadership is, being cynical on purpose. It's that they genuinely believe, the policy is the thing. They wrote the statement, they rolled out the benefits, they checked the box, but no one ever
Hmm.
went back and asked if a manager's calendar or workload actually reflects that belief. The policy and the day-to-day culture just, live in two different buildings. So,
Right.
yes.
Hmm. Right. So what you're saying is basically the outcomes of it are never tracked after putting in the
Yes.
right, 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 right. And so this leads into an interesting anecdote. So could you tell about a time when you watched a leader's mind actually change on this? So, where, they actually saw something that kind of actually changed their beliefs, or not just like agreeing in meetings or something, their actual ideologies or beliefs on mental health at work changed. So, and what
Yes.
actually caused it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the moment I would say that really like drives someone or moves someone are almost, never really in those training sessions. It usually is personal. I've seen it happen when a leader has someone close to them, a kid, a spouse, sometimes themselves go through a real mental health crisis. Suddenly the language they use, is often dismissed as soft or isn't abstract anymore. That's the thing that rewrites how they lead, not a slide deck telling them that burnout is bad for retention. So usually it just comes down to almost like personal, what's going on in their personal life, or maybe they've, experienced, they're in a training session and they go through, role play situations as, they're putting themselves in the individual's shoes, not just, a training session that, just goes through a slide deck, and that's all. So really taking a step back, if it's not themselves or a family member or a friend, I think, watching these leaders go through, role play for maybe weeks or months at a time, and, having that understanding of, mental health at work specifically, and, what they can do to help.
Right, right, right. So what you're saying is basically they would have to kind of experience it personally in in what you've seen. They would kind of have to experience it personally before kind of changing their mind on it. So that's like the biggest driving factor.
Hmm.
Um, right, right, right. I can see that making sense. So for a quick minute, let's just look at the opposite end of this. So we talked about people, who kind of started taking mental health seriously. So let's look at the opposite end where, you know, people who are still kind of following the old-fashioned, as you mentioned in the like drink more water or stuff like that, right? Like basically the old tips. So what was basically the worst advice you've ever heard given to an employee about managing stress or burnout? So advice that came from like leaders, like HR managers, or even like a well-meaning mentor.
I would say the phrase just push through it has to be, one that gets repeated the most. And I see in a lot of, everyday to day work. And it's usually, said with good intention, which almost makes it worse. It comes from managers who push through their own burnout and think that, it's proof that it works. No one stops to ask, what it actually costs them to push through. That advice just passes the damage down to the next person instead of interrupting it. I think a lot of times, they'll look at the week ahead. I've been in situations where, it might be a really busy week, and, maybe next week there's, not a lot going on. There's a lot of events going on this week.
Mhm.
And then, the manager just says, let's just push through it. Let's get through this week, almost noticing that, we're burning out, we're experiencing, these high levels of burnout. Their team is experiencing it, and they're just saying, just push through it. Next week, we'll address the issue. I think that's probably one of the worst things I've heard.
Right, right, right. So it's more of like it's kind of becoming like a culture of, where the manager says, let's just push through it, and they just kind of try to make it through that week while not accounting for the actual underlying factors. And it's just basically to kind of make it to the next week. And, it's kind of like a bad cycle, is what I'm understanding.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so let's just get to the final part of the question, which is so taking everything into consideration, the old habits, the people changing, the good stuff that you observed with regards to like mental health. So if you could burn the current approach to workplace well-being down and mental health in particular and rebuild it from zero. So no budget constraints, no legacy programs, no fear of HR pushback, no policies, nothing. So, what would be one major thing that you would kind of build from scratch, and what would be something that you would kind of leave behind, or you would never bring back?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I'd build is, that manager training that actually is about noticing and responding. So not the once a year compliance video. I'd probably build that, ongoing education piece. Maybe managers sit in like once a week, or, once every 2 weeks, an ongoing training where they're learning. A lot
Hmm.
about mental health these days is, there's so much new, diagnosis is going on, so much new ways to approach how we handle a lot of these situations, and I think, the best thing to do in these situations is to constantly, you want to stay up to date on, ways to help your team, ways to manage everything that's going on and help them and educate your team. And I think it's hard when there's that once a year, video or once a year training. So I
Hmm.
definitely start with that ongoing training. If it's, once a week for an hour or two, most managers want to help their people, but they really have no idea what to say or where the line is between supporting someone and playing their therapist. So that's where I really feel like these trainings come into play, is to educate the team. A lot of, HR leaders these days, of course, they're experienced in their specific field, but they don't have that wellness background, that wellness experience on how to handle these specific situations. Something I would never bring back is that standalone gesture that, lives completely separate from the workload, staffing and how people are actually managed day to day. If the support isn't connected to how the job itself is run, it's just decoration. So yes.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. The ongoing trainings you're saying as in place of like the once a year trainings. I think that would be really useful because once a year people, kind of have the mentality of, let's just get through this and then we're done with it for another year. Whereas ongoing people would kind of take it more deeply, and I think yeah, it would be much more helpful for the team. So yeah, I think these were some great insights, Samantha. Thank you for your time and for basically sharing your stories with the world. Yeah, let's meet again soon for a
Thank
different
you.
topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good day.